Yeah, we're good.
And
We're
Chris,
good.
I'm not sure. Very good, Chris. And you are at this point. I think Carol, you're going to be in charge of the slides, and especially at the beginning here, we'll have to work together because the first few slides we'll do together. But since you're in control, I may have to say click a few times. We'll be a little bit informal, but we'll get the first few slides if that's okay, and then I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so you're going to run the first few, right? I'm not quite hearing everything. You're going to run the first few slides.
And yep. Well, actually, I'll let you. I'll just say next if you don't mind. I'll have you go through the slides, but I'm going to leave you in control so we don't lose it. But I'll go ahead and get us started.
Okay. Got it.
All right. Brandy, am I allowed to start? Give me a thumbs up if I am. Okay. All right. I can see thumbs up. Well, good afternoon. I believe. I hope that at this point, I know we have our recording going on, and we have our guests are here and our friends are here. And for those of you who have joined us month after month, thank you for once again joining us for our Education Thought Leaders and Innovators, our webinar series. We have a really special evening for you tonight with Caroline Tomlinson. We're just so delighted. We have this on a special night because she was kind enough to make herself available for this series. And so we are just so delighted to have her. So before we begin, I want to remind everybody that this is an event that is co-sponsored by the National Education Association, and in particular, our group is Ed Communities, and it's also sponsored by the University of Findlay, which is where I am a professor, and in Findlay, Ohio. And we are just so pleased to have you here tonight with us and with Dr. Tomlinson here. And I also want to thank the leaders here to the NEA I'm with the University of Findlay, but I want to thank Brandy Bixler, who organized this and did all the background work. And Brandy is just an awesome supporter and has taken this. We've been doing this for about 3 years now and has taken this to a new level. And Dr. Tomlinson's participation is an example of that apex. So we're just so excited. And also Chris Thomas. Thank you, Chris. Chris is the technology guru that holds this glue together. So thank you to both of my friends and all of our friends from the NEA for helping us through that. Caroline, I know you have control of it. I want you to pop us through the first couple slides here, and I want to get to really kind of to where we're going to go. But as we get started here, I want to let again everybody know that this is an event that is indeed sponsored by both the NEA and the University of Findlay. The NEA, if you're not familiar with Ed Communities, one of the reasons we have these events is that we're trying to build a large community of practice with educators. We're trying to build a connection with educators that frankly hasn't existed before. We have built a digital community of practice. If you've never been on Ed Communities with the NEA, it is a digital collaboration space where literally educators all over the planet are finding each other, primarily teachers, but educators from all really realms, and finding each other and connecting and collaborating over a wide variety of topics. The cool thing is we have some topics that are set up like differentiation, and we've also got topics that things like bullying, and then there are teachers and educators who get on who have started collaborative groups on their own topic of choice. So it is a collaborative learning space that allows you to find other educators, to collaborate, to connect. It's free. We have sites out there now like Teachers Pay Teachers. Well, this is Teachers Help Teachers, and it's free. So it's a collaborative learning space sponsored by the NEA. Just another one of the things the NEA is doing to become a really robust service agency in the 21st century. So we're really proud of those efforts. Kara, why don't you go ahead and move us? Can you move us into the next slide?
Okay, I think I did. We've got the tips for engagement up there now.
You know what? It's a little slow with me for some reason. It's not advancing. Brandy, do you see it moving through?
Well, that's good. It's on mine. So let me see what I can do here. Brandy, do you have any advice?
Thanks again, and I'm going to move through this kind of quickly because, Carol, I want to give you the time. I want to maximize your time and our connection. Again, folks who are paying attention, thank you for this. This is our spontaneous community of practice. We come together across time zones, and this is what we find. So thank you for your flexibility here. But as I mentioned before, this is our community of practice, our Thought Leaders series. Go ahead, Brandy, next one there. And here are some tips for engagement as you go along. As we go along, at the beginning here, we'll talk at you, but we're going to be talking with you very soon. We want you to mute your microphone if you're not speaking, but we're going to get at the end here. We'd love to see you turn on your camera to see your smiling face to anybody who's participating. There is a raise your hand feature. We'd love to hear you and hear from you if you have a question. You'll see that in participating in this session, you have a chance to ask questions live. You'll have a chance to pose questions in the dialogue box, and it's really fun. It's a fun way to communicate. So if you feel like talking live to Dr. Tomlinson, that would be great to hear you there. If you would like to hear us just do a chat, we'll respond to those as well, and we'll make sure that your questions are answered. Go ahead, Brandy, the next one. And I am your host, Casey Reason, and I've actually just finished my 7th book, and it's an exhausting and fun process. And this particular book was all about how we have, as educators, come to share our thoughts and ideas in digital spaces. And I wrote an awful lot in that book and the book before about ed communities, which is what you're here to learn about. So the next one there, Randy. Enough about me. So I want to jump right in here because we are just so lucky to have Caroline Tomlinson here. And you can see here from her bio here, she's a professor and chair of Ed Leadership and Foundations at the University of Virginia. And she's also the co-director of the university's Institute on Academic Diversity. You can see she has had quite a robust career. I know that almost anybody who has picked up any publication in recent years, she's quoted all the time on the topic of differentiation. And you can see over the past 21 years, she has experience not only obviously at the higher ed level, but as a public school teacher, and really has worked with learners of all levels. And I just think this is such an important topic for you now to have a chance to embrace. And in some ways, isn't it amazing that we have where we've really had to call this out, because we really have an education system that hasn't always prided itself in personalizing the learning experience. And we're talking tonight to one of the real industry leaders in helping us say, come on, this is exactly how we should be approaching teaching and learning. And she's been doing it for quite a long time, again, as both a practitioner and as a scholar and as an author, and has put out so many good works. And so we're going to feature those works, not only here, but in our Ed Communities website. Brandy, go ahead, next slide. And we're just so excited to have Dr. Tomlinson here. So I think, is this the beginning of your slide here, Carol?
That's the beginning of mine, yes.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to you, to Carol, and we're just so glad to have you here and to introduce this topic. And we're going to give, again, Dr. Tomlinson some time here to reflect, and in about 25 or 30 minutes, whatever it takes, when you're done, Carol, you and I will dialogue a little bit, and then anybody that's listening as you go, please keep track of questions. You'll have a chance at the end here to ask questions of Dr. Tomlinson as we go. So, Carol, if that's enough of a preamble here, technology notwithstanding, we're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. Share your wisdom with us. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks to everybody else at the end of a long school day. I hope somebody in the world has had a warm day. It's still snowing here in Virginia on April the 9th, so it's a little strange, but I don't think we're alone in that. We've lost a little bit of time for technology, and poor Brandy is going to have to drive my car here, and we'll just sort of see how that goes. But Brandy, you can kind of, follow my voice, I guess, and as we finish one idea, just sort of go to the next one. So I want to start with you by telling you some things you probably already know. Differentiation, I think, is probably necessary anytime any two kids are in the classroom together. The problem is right now we don't have two kids in the classroom together. We have 25 or 30 or 35 and sometimes more than that. So if you can hit the button the first time, Brandy, they tell us that about 11% of kids in our classrooms have ADHD that's diagnosed. I'm sure some others have it as well, especially in the middle school years. Can you keep going with me? About 13% of kids receive services for learning disabilities. And again, there are probably some students who have those disabilities that aren't receiving services. They tell us now that anxiety is the most prevalent mental health crisis facing Americans as a whole. 8% of teens are diagnosed with anxiety disorders, although countless more teenagers suffer from those symptoms. And that, of course, is not leaving young kids out of the picture either. Autism has increased 120% in the last 10 years. It's the fastest growing disability among school-age children. About 62% of kids who have any kind of disability, this is the punchline for me, spend 80% of or more of their school day in general education classes. And again, that doesn't count students with unidentified disabilities at all. About 51% of kids qualify for free and reduced price meals at school. And of course, poverty is a huge impactor in students' learning and in their readiness to learn. They tell us that there are about 104 million homeless students in our school, which is about 3% of the student population. And about 18% of those kids have disabilities to go along with the homelessness. That doesn't include kids who have been identified as particularly advanced. It doesn't include English language learners. It doesn't include kids whose parents are being divorced or where there's illness in the home. There's so many things that kids come to school with every day that just have to impact their success as learners. And what differentiation is suggesting to us is that when we look at the kids, pretty much all of us see that. And instead of seeing it and saying, okay, I'll just forge ahead with what I had planned today, we're better teachers when we say, let me try to understand who's here and what their needs are. And let me begin to be as fluid and creative as I can be in doing something that gets me closer to those kids and closer to the needs, because I'll be a better professional and the kids will be much better off for it. Let's move ahead, Brandy. So differentiation for me is a mindset that says we can do better than we're doing for more kids than we're reaching. When we teach with student differences in mind, and when we keep those needs in mind as we plan, we'll do better than we do when we don't pay attention to those needs and differences. So differentiation for me is not a set of instructional strategies. It's not a recipe. It's not a template. Rather, it really is a teacher walking in the classroom every day with the intent to know every student better every day, to know our content better every day so that we can connect it better with students, and to plan with the students in the foreground of our thinking along with the content. To become more flexible in our teaching every day, to trust ourselves to say there's one more way to get at this today, there's another thing I haven't tried yet, so that we can connect more kids more fully with learning success. Differentiation then for me, saying this again, is no particular instructional strategy. You can differentiate well, and so can the teacher next to you, and you might never use the same strategies, and that's fine. For me, it's a way of thinking about teaching and learning that advocates beginning where kids are, rather than with a planned, prescribed guide, a plan of action that really pretty much causes us to ignore student variance. So step one is, do you see the differences? Step two is, do you understand what impact they can have on kids' learning success and on their lives? And step three, are you game for trying something to see if there's a way to reach out a little bit better to each of them? John Hattie's work, you may know, he's probably the premier researcher in this generation, wrote a book called Making Visible Learning, and then wrote another book right after that called Visible Learning for Teachers, in which he has unpacked virtually all of the research studies that have been done in the last decade or two to see what it is that has the greatest impact on kids' learning. And when he talks about differentiation, here are a couple of things he says. Differentiation relates primarily to structuring classes so that all students are working at or +1 from where they start. And I love the way he says that. He says our job is not to make them alike every day, not to try to drag them all to the same place every day, but to do whatever we can to move each kid +1 forward, 1 step forward, 1 degree forward from where they started. And to do that, he says, we need to know where each student begins and where each student is day by day in that student's journey toward meeting the criteria of the lesson, which suggests some formative assessment. He says we need to know what the kids' strengths are and what their gaps are in knowledge and in understanding. We need to understand what kind of learning strategies the student has, because many kids don't really know how to take charge of their learning, don't really know what it means to be successful, what their role as learners is. And part of our job is to help kids develop more and more of those strategies so that they really can become captains of their own learning. And then he goes on to say, teaching the class as a whole is unlikely to pitch the lesson correctly for all students. And that's a tough order. The teacher will have to provide different ways in which students can demonstrate mastery and understanding along the way to meeting the criteria of success. And you'll notice there, he doesn't say everybody should have different criteria, different goals. What he says is we're going to have to get really good at creating multiple pathways to reach those goals. You're good, Brandy, to go ahead. You're fine. So the punchline of this, I guess, is that every kid in your class needs you in some unique ways. And they all need you in some common ways as well. And part of the job of differentiation is to help you plan for the things that they need in common and the times when it's better to work with their differences so that we have some sort of a plan for addressing the reality of the differences that are in front of us. So I want to suggest to you that there are 5 elements that we would do well to kind of organize our thinking around in differentiation. These elements are in every classroom, whether we think about them or not. Language is an interesting thing, and the more precision we have in language, the more likely we are to be able to sort of manipulate our environment in a purposeful way. One of the things we need to be thinking about that we can use to serve kids is the nature of our learning environment. John Hattie talks about what he calls an invitational learning environment, a place where kids get up and think in the morning, I want to go to that class, it's going to be okay for me in there. And the great challenge is that all of those kids with all of those various needs need to feel that way about the classroom that they enter. 3 things that make a learning environment really successful or support success for all kinds of kids is a teacher with a growth mindset, a teacher who really truly believes that every kid has the capacity to learn much more than we think they can. A teacher who purposely connects with each kid on a meaningful level. And a teacher who wants to create a community of learners so that the kids don't feel alone, so that they feel that there's always support around them. Unlike being on a really good team where you know that if you can't quite reach the volleyball, somebody else is going to be in there to make sure it goes over. Second thing that we need to think about is the nature of the stuff that we teach. In other words, curriculum. Needs to be a powerful thing. It needs to commend learning to kids. It needs to answer the question, why should any kid of this age want to do this thing today? What is it that really excites their thinking and their mind? And to make sure that our curriculum is working for all kinds of kids, we need to have really clear learning goals. I've called those KUDs, which means what kids should know, understand, and be able to do as the result of any segment of learning. We pretty much always know what we're going to do, but precisely what those goals are is a much stronger target to have. We need to always ask ourselves what we can do to make the curriculum engaging to kids, what we can do to capture their minds and their imagination. We're much better teachers if we have an understanding focused curriculum. In other words, making sure that kids really understand why what they're learning matters, how it works, how it impacts people, how it impacts them. And one of the most important things we can do is to teach up. And what that means is we focus our curriculum on the advanced learners in our classroom, do what we think is necessary to really engage and turn them on, and then scaffold other learners to reach those goals as much as possible. When we do that, we raise the ceiling for everybody. Third big thing that we need to keep working with is uses of formative assessment. A student of mine said, well, it seems like if you care enough about the kids to make that learning environment really powerful, and if you care enough about the curriculum to make it engaging and understanding focused and to teach up, it just sort of seems like you'd want to know where the kids are relative to the stuff all the way during the journey. And what that means is using formative assessment, not just to say that you gave it, but to really change things so you become a better teacher the next day, and also to use it so kids can learn how to trace their own learning and intervene on their own behalf as much as possible. The fourth thing that we need to do then is, once we see that formative assessment information, not just to say, well, they're all over the place, aren't they, and then keep going forward, but to say, how can I arrange the class so that I do two things? I have a highway that we're all going down to try to do things in common, but I'm also going to build off exit ramps when there are systematic points at which I can help kids work with questions they have, skills that they need to develop, more advanced ways of thinking, language. How can I build some of those off ramps to capture kids' varied interests? And what ways can I set up the classroom so kids have some choices about how to learn? In other words, formative assessment needs to lead to change in instruction. And finally, and one of the biggest challenges for us, I think, is learning systematically and over time how to create a classroom that balances predictability and flexibility. Kids need to feel a sense of security and predictability in a classroom, but there also need to be plenty of times where there's flexibility for somebody to use different materials, to work in a different group, to spend a different length of time on something. And learning to create that sort of student-centered classroom is really key to differentiation, but it's also, research tells us, as well as common sense, just key to a classroom that is engaging and successful for kids. So those 5 things have become really important to me in my thinking, to ask what's working for what kinds of kids, and how can I continue to work with each of those elements to make them stronger and more appealing for more kids. So when this next graphic, I kind of liked when I found it. Thought this is a picture of what I just said. What we're talking about is learning environment, turning with curriculum, turning with formative assessment, turning with responsive instruction, and then on the outside, leading kids and managing routines so that those things can turn together. But as it happens, science teachers kept saying to me that this wouldn't work because those cogs don't turn together, which I found sort of annoying, but true nonetheless. So I was a pretty happy girl when I found this next graphic when I was working on a slide presentation one night, where you can see those cogs turning together. And really what great teaching is, I think, is trying to be really sure that the best of our environment supports the curriculum and assessment, that the best of assessment supports the environment and instruction, that our leadership style and management of routines supports all those other things, and that everything works as smoothly as possible in the classroom. I've been at this a long time, and I've, maybe had 10 days in my 50-year career that looked like that cog where everything's perfect. But that doesn't mean you don't keep trying and that you don't understand what's happening when things are working well and what the cost is when they're not. I saw a question there, Chris, but it went away. So I'll wait and we'll take it maybe at the end, unless there's a way to get it back. Okay, Brandy, we'll go to the next slide and we'll take care of that later. Can you go forward with me? The slide on my screen didn't go anywhere then, I'm sorry. Ah, okay. So I want to share a quotation with you that I thought was kind of interesting and strong when I saw it. Lorna Earle is a Canadian educator, and she wrote one time, she's a very well-regarded person in the field of instruction and assessment. She said, the teacher's overriding moral purpose is to meet the needs of students, even when that conflicts with personal preferences. And I believe that, and some days I'm sorry that I believe that, but I believe it for two reasons. She says that we need to do that, and if you'll click 2 more times, Brandy will be there. We need to do what students need us to do, even when it's inconvenient, because it's what professionals do, and it's also the ethical thing to do. And I really have come to believe over my years of teaching that I'm a better professional when I work with students in the foreground of my thinking, and when I understand both the opportunity and the obligation I have to do the very best that I can for them. So I'm going to suggest to you that there are 3 ways that we can particularly get closer to student-centered instruction. And some of this is sort of saying what I just said in a recap, but I want to illustrate these a bit for you. And Brandy, if we can truck on kind of quickly, this is probably the best part for folks because it has some illustrations in it, and we'll see how much of it we can do before we need to go to questions. First thing I need to do is know my kids and let them know that I really care about them enough to intervene on their behalf. And that means things like I work daily to know you better. I want you to help me understand you. You matter to me as an individual, and I want you to know that you're going to be my teacher at the same time that I'm going to be your teacher. So let me show you just a few ways, a very few, that I've seen teachers do this. For me, it mattered hugely in my middle school classes to be at the classroom door when kids came and went every day. That's one of the few times when I could really speak to each individual and try to make a little contact. It was helpful for me to watch them outside the classroom as they got off buses, in the cafeteria, in the gym, wherever I could see them. I got much closer to them when I met with them in small learning groups rather than always talking to them as a group of 35 or 40. I found it was really powerful to continually move among my students as they worked, to talk with them quietly, and to jot down notes on what I was seeing from them. And then I put those in notebooks by class so I could get back to them really easily. I used personal journals that I created just for students to write to me and let me write back to them. And for some kids, that was a huge opportunity to feel connected with an adult. You can use a variety of surveys. If we're going to study this unit and it has these 4 subtopics in it, which one would you like to specialize on? What's the best project you've ever done in school, and why was it so good for you? If you had a choice of expressing yourself this way, or this way, which one would you choose? Really maximizing class discussion time so that kids have a voice, and the voice is not always mine. Meeting with kids one-on-one is hugely important. As difficult as it is, if you can find just a couple of minutes to meet with each student individually over the course of a month, makes a great difference that you can look at them eyeball to eyeball and exchange some ideas with them about their own work. It's a real helpful thing to ask kids, maybe sometimes on a Friday, to jot down for you how they think class is going for them, what's been working well, and what you could change to make it better. They have amazing insights, of course. Don't always want to hear them, but they do have really good insights. And finally, number 10 is lurking down there somewhere. If you can do it, have an open room policy someday where secondary kids can come into your room and bring lunch and work together on something. Designated shared lunch days in a room or in the cafeteria for elementary folks. Anything that you can think of. You can think of 25 more things that are better than those. The stuff that lets you see and connect with students rather than always talking about the class as though everyone in there were pretty much the same. This guy, who's a teacher in Chicago, has made it a habit anytime he gives his students a piece of paper with something they need to complete, to add something like this little purple thing at the top. So they give him the name and date and the class period, but what's been the best thing about this week for you? And you'll see at the bottom that some other things he's asked at some point is, what would you rather do than be in my class right now? Which is a brave question. How are you feeling about the novel or the kind of math or the history that we're studying? What's your favorite movie? Do you like hot dogs? What do you like on them? What are you worried about now? And the kids get used to filling those things in. And it's interesting, if you talk with those students, they'll tell you he's a teacher who really cares about them. Partly just because he asks those things, but partly because he follows up at the door, or he makes connections between something you said and something he does in class. Just that one thing makes them feel much more listened to. Here's another idea from an elementary teacher who asked his kids to create a glyph, a figure, to represent themselves. Go to the next slide, Brandy. He asked them to make the body of the cutout the color of their favorite subject in school. So if you like math best, you make a purple body. If you like science best, you make a red body. He asked them to make their least favorite subject in school their hair color. And so again, if you really don't much care for reading, you're going to have blue hair. If you're a boy, use shorts. If you're a girl, use pants. And in either case, make them your favorite color. Go to the next one, Brandy. In this particular school, they spend time talking to kids about the fact that there's so many ways to be intelligent, so many kinds of abilities that impact the world. And so the kids are used to this language. So he said to them, make your shirt the color of the thing that you think is maybe your greatest strength in terms of one of your reasoning capacities. Make a learning preference your shoe color. So if you think you learn better when you see things than when you hear them, your shoes would be white. Next slide. If you like to work alone on projects, put stripes on your shirt. If you'd rather work in groups, put polka dots on your shirt. And I love this last one. If you'd like to be challenged and learn new and difficult things, design a hat for yourself. And lo and behold, everybody did a hat. Now, one possibility is they just wanted to make a hat, but I'm Pollyanna enough to believe that most kids, in fact, do want to be challenged and learn new things. So then he got all of the kids to put their cutouts on the board, and he left them up there for a day. And on the second day, he said, okay, today as you have time, I want you to go by the bulletin board and just stand there for a few minutes and take an index card, put your name at the top of it, and then I want you to write down the names of all the other kids whose cutouts are just like yours. And as you can imagine, they stood there for quite a while and nobody could ever find a cutout that was just like theirs. And so he started the conversation with them by saying, so what do I do about that? Do I go with the kids that have the stripes, or do I go with the kids that have the dots? Do I cut down on science if some kids don't like that, but then other kids do? So maybe I should pump up the time. How do I handle that? And it started for them a conversation that progressed for the whole year about what it means to create a classroom that is really trying to make a success for everybody, a real possibility. Next example I want to show you comes from a blog that I suspect a lot of you know, The Humans of New York, where a photographer stays on the streets of New York a lot and takes pictures of people he thinks are interesting and interviews them and posts little excerpts from what they say. So he saw this little guy who looks to me to be maybe 4th or 5th grade, maybe a little older. And he said to him, you know what you want to be when you grow up? And the kid said, a train. It's a fascinating answer for a child. It makes me make up 100 stories about him. But when I look at him now, he's not just a face to me. He's somebody that I think I know something about and want to keep thinking about. Here's another example from Humans of New York. These two brothers were walking down the street, and the younger one said, I'm not very good at science. We did this experiment where we were supposed to measure the pH of water, but I messed up. And the interviewer says, what happened? And the little boy says, I spilled the water in the computer. That's a 4-line story. and probably tells you a lot about that little kid, and you probably taught him at some points as well. But again, it separates him out. It's his voice there. I'll show you one last one from the actual Humans of New York blog. Young woman sitting in the subway station writing, and she says to the photographer, "I'm terrible at journaling, but I do it anyway because I think someday I might write something that I didn't know before, and then it will all make sense." Such a powerful little story. So this high school teacher on the next slide, whose work some of you might know, Sarah Brown-Wessling, took that idea and created a Humans of Room 506 bulletin board as a way to start the year. Every student in the class interviewed every other student. And then students took their own selfies and they selected a powerful quote from an interview with a student to go with that picture, and very nicely matted them and put them on the bulletin board. And she said it's amazing how much time they spent looking at those and how much it meant to be able to capture those 1 or 2 line things that really suddenly make this person real to you, a little bit more 3-dimensional, a little bit more human, and a little bit more like you are. There are 1,000 things you can do to make time and to make opportunities to get to know kids, but those kinds of things start a lot happening that's very positive in a learning sequence. I want to share with you about 3 or 4 research findings here really quickly. John Hattie says that teacher-student relationships are one of the 5 most powerful strategies to impact learning. More powerful than time on task, more powerful than the teacher's content knowledge, more powerful than many things is how the kid connects with you and how connected they think you are to them. Another study suggests to us that teacher emotional support is one of the most powerful predictors of student achievement, and this one actually says the most powerful, and accounts for as much as 16% of a student's variance of achievement. So that teachers who have low emotional support, students really drop in their achievement, and teachers who have very high emotional support have students that rise in their achievement really dramatically. And that's been the case in the studies that they've done in hundreds of classrooms from the earliest grades through high school. In James Strong's work, where he's looked at many studies to try to digest what makes effective teachers, he says that the 2 primary factors that distinguish top teachers from others are the degree of caring and classroom management. In other words, being able to create that flexible, stable classroom. And next one. So here's a thing that I have come to believe over time. Every kid in your classroom really wants to be cared for. You're a powerful figure in that child's life, and there isn't any real recipe for caring. You don't say, oh, this kid needs to be cared for. Now, what's step 1, what's step 2, and I'll follow those steps. It's a mental attitude that you go into a room with that says, whatever's happening outside this room, when I'm in here for you. And the most important thing that I'm going to do today is get to know you a little bit better and to work together with you to build your success. Nell Nodding says caring is a way of being in relation to people, not a specific set of behaviors. And it's an extraordinarily important one. So if the knowing and caring is the first big step, believing in kids is the second one. And that's the growth mindset thing again. I really believe that if I work as hard as I can, and you work with me as hard as you can, and we keep at it, and we analyze what's working and what's not, you're going to get where you need to get. That doesn't mean every child becomes Einstein instantly, but it does mean that every kid can really see growth and can attach their own effort to that growth. So let's take a little bit of a look at what some examples here might be. How do we demonstrate that belief? Teach with a growth mindset, so kids see you talking to each of them as though you have full belief in them and as though they all have capacity. Whenever you can, use strength-based approaches rather than deficit-based approaches so kids get to do what they can do best. Spend time with students and with each student. Invest in them in any way you can. Unpack your thinking for them so you're telling them why you do what you do when you teach, especially why you're doing things to benefit them. Spend some time sharing your stories and experiences with them. That's a mighty powerful thing in most classrooms. Create tasks that are respectful so you don't have some kids doing work that looks like they're really smart and capable and other kids look like all they can do is fill in blanks. Hard as it is, make it a goal to always speak with respect and caring. That's something that we can actually control, and it's mighty powerful. Give kids choices when you can give them choices. That speaks of trust, and it speaks of your sense that they are able and can make good decisions in their lives. And when they can't, help them learn how to make better ones. Teach kids the skills that they need in order to succeed. We know what those skills are, and we need to be teaching those as much as any content we teach. And then this is the big one. What step can you take with a kid to prove that that kid can succeed today? I saw an interview in our University of Virginia newsletter a couple of weeks ago that I took a quotation out of from a young neurobiologist, and someone asked her, she's in the med school, and someone asked her, what's the one thing that you'd like everybody to know about neurobiology and the science of learning? And here's what she said. I think we need to get away from the idea of fixed capability, that we're born with certain strengths and weaknesses that can't be changed. Children come into a classroom with a high degree of capability, but not always with the right tools and not always with the right skills. Neuroscience research has shown us that the brain is not modular. In other words, it's not that one particular region is responsible for one particular function. The brain is comprised of a network of regions that work in concert to accomplish a given task, and its plasticity and malleability are really astounding. When we know that about the brain, we have every reason to believe that we can build brains just like we build bodies in the gym. And the opportunity for a teacher to do that, I think, is, especially for teachers who are just now beginning their careers, one of the most exciting things that's happened in education probably ever. So the last piece, I'm going to do 2 or 3 of these things or bust trying, is so now what do I do to respond to kids? I see the differences. I work with them to establish the relationships. I really do teach them as much as I possibly can with full belief in their capacity and doing what I can do to make that belief real, viable, visible. How do I respond when I see the differences? So let's look at just a few things here again, and then we'll take some questions. Using small group instruction is way more powerful than it seems. When you can get to a small group eyeball to eyeball, you can see so many misunderstandings. You can push kids' thinking further. It's a great formative assessment tool. Try to find materials at different reading levels on the same topic. That's so very possible now. There's so many wonderful websites that will give you materials at multiple lexile levels so that kids can all be reading the same article, but in a way that actually makes sense to them. It's really powerful. Use mini conferences when kids are working on something and you're walking around and you realize that you've now seen the same mistake made 3 times. Just stop the kids and say to them for a minute, guys, as I'm walking around, I see that several of you have forgotten how to use an index and it's slowing you way down with what you're trying to do. So if you have any doubt about how to use an index, come over here and stand on this side of the room with me for just a minute. We'll review that. You can go back to your seat and I can almost guarantee you you'll be doing better. Times that you can just pull spontaneously a few kids together. Differentiate homework. Folks are writing whole books on this now because homework is such a bear. They tell us that it's like something that if you can't do at least 90% of the homework without any adult help by yourself, it's working against you instead of for you. But if you can do 95% of it without any adult help, it's a waste of time. That's a really small target. There ought to be times when we're sending kids home to work on what they need to work on to move forward, rather than always sending them home to work on the same thing that everybody else does. It's number 6 in here somewhere. Whenever you can, say to kids, guys, here's what you need to show me today. But it's okay with me if you do it in a chart. It's okay with me if you do it in an annotated diagram. It's okay if you do it in a dialogue. It's okay if you do it in a paragraph. And if you have a better way, come talk to me and we'll see if we can make that work too. The mode is not nearly as important as the opportunity to show, let kids show what they know. Experts on assessment tell us that the sign of a good assessment is that there's nothing in the assessment that blocks kids' capacity to show us the knowledge. And for many kids, writing long prose does, in fact, inhibit them from sharing what they know. When you can do it, attach content to kids' interest and experiences. Everything in the world attaches to everything else. So there's a way to hook the art, the music, the math to things that kids like. Be flexible with time and space. Just try to keep loosening up a little bit. It's doable. You can use hint cards, experts of the day, models of quality kid work at different levels of complexity, many things that you can learn to do, again, slowly and over time in a classroom to boost kids' capacity to work successfully. And then develop your own toolkit of strategies that invite attention to students' varied needs. In math, you might have a different toolkit than you would in art, and that might be a different toolkit than you would have in history. But whatever the strategies are that fit the personality of your subjects and the needs of your students that enable you to break work down into small group and individually is really great. So let me share with you a couple of those tools now. And one of those is a thing that folks call a contemporary lecture. Most of us have heard many times that lecture is not a real great way to teach and learn, but we still sort of persist. So some teachers said, okay, what if we modified the lecture so that it was more learning friendly, more learner friendly? And to do that, they suggest a few steps. First, don't just do a lecture. Ask yourself first, when we're finished with this, what should kids know? What should they understand? What should they be able to do? And now then build the lecture around those KUDs so that the students are really getting the information and ideas they need to focus on what the precise outcomes ought to be. Develop one or more graphic organizers that you can reuse time after time so that for kids who need it, there's something that scaffolds their ability to follow the lecture and to actually capture information from it that's meaningful. Don't give those to students who can already do that on their own, because scaffolding needs to come down when it's no longer necessary. And then neuroscientists tell us that it's really important to stop about every 7 or 8 minutes, no more than that in a lecture, to get kids to summarize on a sheet of paper, to summarize with the kid next to them, to explain why something's happening, to draw a conclusion from what you just said, to project what's going to happen next, to connect it back with yesterday, and so forth. Just doing those things opens up success so much to so many more kids. It's responsive to what kids' needs are. A young friend of mine who teaches in a very challenging school in Nashville, Tennessee, where kids have extraordinarily challenging lives, has for years front-loaded vocabulary for his history students when he's getting ready to start a unit. But he said to me recently, I think if it makes sense to front-load vocabulary, I've got kids where I need to front-load the unit, front-load the whole thing. So now before the unit begins, he meets in small groups with kids who need extra support. And in kind of a conversational storytelling sort of way, he gives them a synopsis for maybe 10, 15 minutes of what the unit's going to be about, stopping to ask them questions and see what they're thinking. It's really to provide the context and the big picture of a unit that's coming that some kids probably come into school with and some kids just don't. It's a great way to help with experience gaps and language gaps. And the idea of it really is more or less kind of like a trailer for a movie or a TV show that gives you sort of a vivid way of seeing what the progression's going to be so that there's something to hook things to as you go on. So he's front-loading a unit as a way to help his kids. Here's a world language teacher who periodically sets up her room in 4 stations, and she assigns kids to the stations for several days, depending on their needs. Some kids might rotate through all of the stations, being in one each for 4 days. Some students might stay longer at station 1. Some students might skip station 2. It's just simply an organizational tool that allows her to put an emphasis where kids really need it in an organized way, so that for a little while they can focus on the things that they need to focus on to be able to do what John Taddy says, move one step forward. And I'm going to get you to skip this slide, and I'm just going to explain it, Brandy, because we're running out of time. This is the last thing I'll show you. Teaching up is the idea that if we started our lesson planning asking what would it take to get the most advanced kids in this class really excited and primed, and then started teaching everybody that way with scaffolding to help other kids, it would be really powerful. And so I want to see if I can tell you this story really quickly, and it's a little longer than I have to tell you, but I was asked to observe in a classroom one year where 3 teachers were teaching the same subject. And I always think when somebody asks me to come in that that's such a wonderful thing on that teacher's part, to really be brave enough to ask somebody to come in and to ask for feedback. And I always feel like I'm the bigger beneficiary there. That day when I walked in, I was going to go to 3 classes. I just happened to go to the one that was closest to me when I got into the building. And in that class, I saw a teacher who was working with her kids on measurement, quantities, gallons, how big a container is it going to take to hold whatever volume. And I had 2 thoughts. One was that she had done some really good work. The kids were carrying things and measuring them and putting stuff in vessels to hold them. So they might be trying to figure out how much sand would fit in something, how many rocks would go in the same thing. So I was really impressed with the hands-on work she had done and the fact that they were really having hands-on experiences. The second thought I had was that it looked sort of like somebody must have died the day before. And that really was a thought I had, because they were kids and there was no joy. They were doing everything. Nobody was fussing or making any trouble. It was just not very kid-like. I walked in the second room and lo and behold, they were studying measurement also. But in that classroom, the teacher had created a really neat exercise where she had a figure on a projection board and was asking kids about moving around some things on there to make shapes. And sometimes she'd move them and sometimes they'd come up and move them. And again, it was a really thoughtful lesson in the hands-on stuff. The kids were working with it really well. And then I'm beginning to think maybe somebody really did die, because as well as they were attending, there was just no pleasure. There was no joy. I walked into the third classroom and discovered where all the joy was. I thought they were going to blow me out of the room. I got there at exactly the moment that a teacher had finished explaining an example and let the kids go for the first time to work on it. And what he had asked them to do was to design a zoo where they were going to actually take the design that they finally created to the local commissioners who were actually thinking about planning a zoo. And what he had challenged them to do was to work in teams, so that somebody was going to plan a house for the snakes, the invertebrates, and somebody was going to do birds, and somebody was going to do the big cats, and somebody's going to do bats. And the deal was you had to figure out the ideal amount of space your creatures would need by researching, and to understand how much water was going to be necessary for them. It was not going to be the case that everybody could have as much space as they needed, so you were going to have to compromise with the other animal houses, but you're also going to have to compromise with the group that had to build a McDonald's and a parking lot and a t-shirt shop so that they could make money in the thing. And the kids were so excited they were about to jump out of their minds. And I have stayed up many a night thinking about that, asking myself, why couldn't all the kids be in that design a zoo thing? Why couldn't you have teachers as consultants so that when kids needed some support, any kid, they could go to that teacher to work, or teachers could pull some kids for that purpose? Why was it necessary for only the really most able kids to be able to design the zoo? And the other kids knew that the good stuff was happening in that room next door, and that what they were doing, though they were well-planned lessons, is not where the joy was. It was not where the real excitement was. So the idea of teaching up is something to really think about anytime you can in your classrooms, and anytime we can do that, what we find is that student achievement is much better. So let's go forward one more, Brandy, and then we'll take the questions here. One more still. A teacher said a couple of years ago in an email to me, I came into this profession because I believe every student deserves the best possible future, and I'll go above and beyond to help each of them because I never expect it will be easy to teach. I thought that was a really powerful line. Teaching's not easy on any day for any teacher. I've done it for a long time, and I have really mostly loved it more than anything, but easy it never was. So really what differentiation is a desire to get better with this yourself +1 every day. So that at the end of a year, you're better with it than you were at the beginning of that year. And at the end of 3 years, you're much better than you were 3 years ago. And at the end of 10 years, you're beginning to think you've gotten somewhere. So I'll ask Brandy to go to the last slide and share with you one of my favorite thoughts about life and about teaching. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I'll try again tomorrow. And I think when you're trying to teach, that's the way to go at it. And when you're trying to teach with individual kids in mind, that's really it. Okay, well, we don't have very much time for questions, Casey, but let's see what we can do with that. I think you've gotten at least a few in there.
Carol, we do have a couple, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But first, I want to thank you. And for those of you who are listening, if you haven't had a chance to read Dr. Tomlinson's work, this was such an exciting night for us because her books are just as approachable and thoughtful as she was tonight. And having read your stuff over the years, Carol, I was just delighted to sit through that and experience that. So thank you, and for all of our friends. I want to ask you one question. We do have one question from our friends, but Carol, it seems so logical that differentiation, I mean, it almost seems like in our profession, we wouldn't even need to, it seems like that would be what we do. What is it about our profession that would require us to have to work so hard to do something that you've made seem so logical and obvious to us?
You know, it's a funny thing, really, Casey, and all of us know this. It's just a small little slice of history. For many years in this country, teachers taught in one-room schoolhouses, and they had 6-year-olds in the room with 18-year-olds, and sometimes the 18-year-olds were reading better than the 6-year-olds, or worse than the 6-year-olds were. It never occurred to them to say, because you're 18, you have to do more advanced math than somebody who's 10. They just looked to see where the kids were, and then they arranged the kids flexibly. And would move them around and have different kids helping each other with different things. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the one-room schoolhouse and have to show up at 6 in the morning to put wood in the fireplace to make things work. But truly, in some ways, we were thinking in a more humane and logical way in terms of meeting kids where they are. At some point in history, then somebody said, oh, well, this is silly. This, you know, lots of little schools with all kinds of kids in different ages in the same room. We'll just make a bigger school and we'll put all the 6-year-olds in one room and all the 7-year-olds. And at that point, the idea became all the 6-year-olds were alike. You know, we've just fallen for that hook, line, and sinker. And then, of course, the more we have mandated standardized tests, which become defining thing for everything, including us as teachers, and this huge pressure and pacing guides that say, you know, you can't even be on a different page than somebody on another day. It just makes it mighty, mighty hard to reach out to kids. And to make it worse, most of us haven't been taught that way ourselves, and most of us were not taught to teach that way. We don't have images for it. And we're in desperate need of seeing those and creating those and sharing them with other people.
I love that answer. And that, you know, it really speaks to many of those issues are man-made. We've created those with our system. And so we have the ability to shape those systems back the other way. And your work certainly leads us that way. I'm going to work backwards, Michelle, and then we'll have to cut it off here. But Michelle has a quick question. She goes, how do you recommend that we progress monitor differentiation strategies to evaluate which ones work best for specific students?
Well, I think this is a silly answer, but it's one that it took me a long time to come to, which is to say to the kid, how's this working for you? You know, can you it done? Does it make sense when you've done it? Can you sort of explain what you've done? I think really just kind of watching that. And the crazy thing, I think John Hattie says in his work, which I have great respect for, he says, we really ought to be asking not what's the right route or what strategy works, but what strategy works for which kid in which situation at this moment. And that's a great question that you're asking, because you're kind of getting it where he is. There are some things, clearly, you have some students that really have difficulty with language. It may be because of a learning disability that impacts reading or writing, maybe a student with second language issues, maybe a kid who has difficulty attending and comprehending. So there's some strategies that let you, they just lend themselves well to working with writing or to spotlighting reading or something like that. A good example for me would be a multiple entry reading log, where a teacher can have different things that kids respond to before they read and then while they read and after they read, and you can change the prompts depending on the kid's sophistication with language. But I might first look to see what are some defining traits of particular kids, some things that seem to be real needs, and also some things that seem to be real strengths. And then ask myself, given the stuff that the kids need to be working on now, which strategy also fits the stuff? For example, there's a thing called a raft assignment. That's a wonderful thing to use when you want kids to do sort of a thinking and writing or self-expression sort of task. And it works many times, but it's probably not a very great strategy to help kids memorize the periodic table if you're going to ask them to do that, or a verb conjugation if that's where you are. So looking at the kids' needs, at their strengths and the requirements of a particular lesson. And then if you have a few of those strategies that you're accustomed to, your common sense will begin to say this one will work here, but this other one won't work quite so well at this time. Or maybe it's the case that some of the kids need to use one and some another, even though you're working on the same task. So I think beginning to develop that toolbox of strategies and kind of looking for what each of them contributes to your learning goals.
Wow, I really appreciate that answer, and I'm sure Michelle does as well. And our fans are hanging in there. We'll ask one more question, Carol, and thank you for staying a minute long, and we'll promise to be the last one, and thank you for hanging out with us. But Susan asked early on, I'm going to read it verbatim because I think I have it correctly. I've got my glasses on here. But she said, I'm wondering how to gracefully make exits with students such that the other students do not want that path that is not their up.
Can you say that again for me, Casey? I'm not sure I quite got it.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I want to make sure I'm honoring it correctly. But she says, I'm wondering how to gracefully make exits with students such that other students do not want the path that is not their up. In other words, I think she's talking about how do I give a chance for a student to move up, and one student to move up, while the other students, that might not be their path. If other kids see that that you're trying to give that upward path and it's not theirs, how do you up one and not the other, I think is what she's asking.
Yeah, my best answer on that is that I really like the man who did the bulletin board with the glyphs on it, because what he's doing is starting a year-long conversation with his kids. If we do stuff to kids, they're always kind of suspicious. Why did she give him a different piece of paper than me? She likes him better because he got to use this piece of equipment today and I didn't. If you're really having a conversation with kids from day one about what's something that really helps you when you learn? Does it help your brother too necessarily, or might he come at it a different way? Can you think of a time when you would have done something a different way than you were told to do it, and it would have probably been better for you that way? I saw a teacher once who sent a questionnaire home in kindergarten and asked the parents to write down when the kid walked first, when he talked, when he sat up, a bunch of things like that, when the teeth got loose. And she made a chart on the board and showed it to these little kids, and they understood it really well. She said, look, somebody started walking when they were this age, and then somebody else started walking when they were 5 months older. But they're both walking now, so does it really much matter when they started walking? What matters is they're walking, isn't that right? And she really was giving them this sense that you develop at your own pace and that you don't necessarily always need things that the others do. And I found for me, it took me several years to understand this, but once I began really unpacking my thinking with the kids and invited them to do the same with me, they really understood what the game plan was. And so they could tell any guest in the room why they weren't using the same books all the time, or why somebody might be working alone and somebody else was working with a partner or in a group of three. And they understood that as well as I did. They understood that when I gave them different things to do on some days, it was because I had looked at an assessment the night before and I could see what their particular needs were. And it wasn't because I liked or disliked somebody. It's that my whole goal every day was to ask them what their next step was and to help them take their next step. So I think sometimes we skip that piece of really building a logic and a philosophy with kids, but it's powerfully important to do that and to keep at it throughout the year. Casey, I think your microphone is not on, maybe.
I muted because when we were both talking, I was drowning you out, so I apologize. But what a great message and what a great way to end and to really personalize that experience for those students and to give them that grace. Carol, thank you for your work. Thank you for your work tonight with this group. I can tell you they deeply appreciate you. They appreciate your work. They all stayed late for you, and you were wonderful and gracious. And thank you for giving us your time. Brandy has been kind enough. Thank you, Brandy, for triggering us through tonight, keeping us going. Sorry, Carol, for the technology, but this webinar will be available on where Brandy has showed us, and will be on Ed Communities. And we hope you support Carol's work. And there'll be a link to her website and her books on the Ed Communities as well. So Carol, thanks for staying up late with us. Thanks for sharing with our community. Thanks for a whole career of wonderful contributions. We really are fans of your work, and we're so delighted. You are by far the biggest star we've ever had on the stage. So thank you for joining us tonight.
I appreciate the groups being here tonight. Anybody that shows up for something like this at the end of the day is a hero, needs a merit badge, if nothing else. Probably better would be a cup of coffee. But I really appreciate the teachers and keep trying to learn at the same time. It's a very impressive, energizing thing.
Well, I hope your love for the profession is so obvious. So thank you for joining us tonight. And everybody have a great night. Carol, really nice meeting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.